Hello, and welcome to my living room. This is the first in a series of videos that I'm going to be recording from Chicago and sending to you, dear Theophilus. This is about argumentation, and I want to give you three things that I want to tell you about argumentation and how you develop argumentation from the beginning. Now, the first preliminary before I get to those 3 points is that argumentation is the fundamental aspect of the activity of debate. Before you can come up with cross-examination questions that lead your opponents in the direction that you want them to go, you need to know what direction you want to move them toward. And that requires needing to have a conclusion toward which you are driving through a series of arguments. Before you can actually effectively research, there are some things you can do with research without having an argument, but most of the time you're researching in order to prove, or more accurately, disprove a hypothesis or some sort of conclusion that you want to test through the acquisition of data, evidence, expert testimony, articles by experts in the field, or newspapers that just testify to what has actually occurred. Now, before you can do any of those things, cross-examine or research, write a case, you need to have an argument that you're making. So the second preliminary, let me define what an argument is for you. It's a reason or set of reasons for a claim or conclusion to be true. This, of course, raises the question of what truth is. Truth is that which absolutely corresponds with reality, and so arguments need to be rooted in facts. You need to have a command of facts before you can be effective at arguing. Now, the three things I'm going to tell you are going to be, first of all, that you need to develop a questioning mindset, one that questions the facts that are presented to you, and more importantly, questions the arguments that you're presented with. Secondly, you need to develop a habit of thinking in terms of criterias. Now, of course, everyone does think in terms of criterias, but I'm going to explain what that is. And then thirdly, you need to have an argumentative attitude. And I don't mean by that a combative attitude, but I mean an attitude where you actually argue. So in order, what does it mean to develop a questioning mindset? That means when you are presented with a claim, which you will be presented with every day, actually multiple times per minute if you are on the internet surfing or just having a conversation with anyone, you need to start thinking about why what they say is true. Sort of that little kid-like curiosity that just says, why is the sky blue? Right? Well, they might answer you, well, because there are chemicals in the sky, I believe something along the lines of nitrogen, and light refracts off those chemicals in a way that our eyes detect the color blue. Well, that might not be a satisfactory answer to a little kid. Well, why are those chemicals there, right? And you can go down the rabbit trail, and that is what allows you to start developing what an argument might be. And then you need to also start asking the second big question, which is, so what? Okay, so what if the sky is blue because of chemicals? What does that say about our universe, right? Does it say that there was maybe a design to our universe? Does it suggest that there was perhaps a series of random events that led to our universe? And you need to ask those questions and then make arguments one way or another. The second thing, you need to think in terms of criterias. To put this formally, you need to evaluate whether A or B is better in terms of C, that third thing. To put it in a little bit more of a concrete term, you might say something like liberty is better than security in terms of human flourishing or in terms of virtue. Now, what is virtue? What is human flourishing? Now, when you get to policy debate, you'll have more specific criteria, like economic development or national security or fulfilling the constitutional obligations of the government before us. But what you need to do is you need to start thinking of how you weigh one thing in terms of another thing, right? Why liberty might be better than security in terms of human flourishing? Well, in order to flourish as human beings, we need to be virtuous. And virtues can't be forced. We need to choose those things. And therefore, we need to choose whether or not we're going to be vicious, indulge our vices, or whether or not we're going to be virtuous and act as human beings ought to act. And if we don't have liberty, we won't have that ability to make that choice. So liberty is more important than security in terms of human flourishing, which is choosing the virtuous life, which by definition requires a certain degree of freedom. Right? That way of thinking is where you start to develop arguments. right? So maybe with a policy resolution along the lines of the United States federal government should substantially change its policy toward the nation state of Israel, you might suggest something like Israel's aid from the United States is more important to Israel with respect to United States national security, or with respect to our commitment to democracy in the Middle East and self-determination, or in terms of our commitment to the people of Jewish ancestry after World War II, that our aid to Israel might be part of that, right? So that's how you think in terms of criterions, as a couple of examples. Thirdly, you need to have an attitude that is argumentative. And by that I mean you can't take conclusions lying down. When a conclusion comes your way, you need to ask why, and then you need to be willing to posit the alternative, to raise an objection, to say, maybe that isn't correct, and the reason that it might not be correct is because something other than that is correct. And then you need to start supplying reasons for why the alternative might be, in fact, correct, right? So back to our liberty and security example. Maybe you come along and say, well, security is a prerequisite to life. If you don't have life, you can't exercise liberty. If you're dead, and if you are too concerned about worrying about whether or not you'll have life, you're not going to be very concerned about contemplating the good, and without contemplating the good, how would you know what virtue is? And if you don't know what something is, how can you pursue it? How can you choose it? So security is a prerequisite to the exercise of liberty, which is a prerequisite to virtue and human flourishing. So in terms of human flourishing, in fact, liberty might not be more important than security. And this is an ageless argument. And that's why you need to study the ageless truths that have been argued and debated in philosophers from Aristotle and Cicero, the scriptures that are before you in the ancient Hebrew prophets, all the way through St. Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, pardon my mispronunciation, and all the way up to America's founders and the contemporary discourse today. So it's all interlocked. You need to research and have an understanding of reality and the facts before you can start making arguments, which are evaluations or reasons for why claims might be true, which is why they might correspond with reality. But you also need to have those arguments in place in order to navigate and start looking for and knowing what to look for in your research. This has been a living room chat, the first of probably many, from Elliot Geiser, and I hope all the best to you, dear Theophilus.